The original Star Wars trilogy was already complete in a way that modern franchise logic fundamentally struggles to understand. It was not designed as a modular narrative system meant to be endlessly appended, but as a myth with a deliberate arc and a clear destination. Each film moved with intention toward resolution rather than expansion. There is a confidence in how the story unfolds that signals an understanding of finality. The trilogy knows what it is building toward and never loses sight of that end. From the very beginning, the story establishes stakes that are emotional rather than procedural. The fall of the Empire is not treated as an administrative challenge, but as a moral reckoning. The conflict is framed around choice identity and belief rather than territory or governance. This allows the story to conclude once those moral questions are answered. When the characters resolve who they are, the galaxy follows naturally. The structure of the trilogy mirrors classical myth rather than serialized fiction. Each installment advances a clear phase of transformation rather than opening new narrative obligations. The first film introduces longing and possibility. The second introduces doubt and cost, and the third resolves both through confrontation and acceptance. Nothing essential is left hanging because the story was never about endless struggle. It was about arriving at understanding. Luke Skywalker completes a full arc that does not require supplementation to feel valid. He begins as someone defined by absence and fantasy, and ends as someone grounded in responsibility and restraint. His final victory is not achieved through superior power, but through refusal to abandon his values. This resolution is inward rather than external, which makes it complete rather than provisional. There is no missing chapter required to justify who he becomes. What makes Luke's arc especially durable is that it ends with moral clarity rather than dominance. He does not overthrow evil by becoming stronger than it, but by rejecting its logic entirely. This choice answers the trilogy's central question about power and identity. Once that answer is given, the story has nowhere meaningful left to go. Any continuation risks undoing the resolution rather than deepening it. Darth Vader likewise reaches a conclusion that is both definitive and restrained. His past is hinted at, but not dissected, and his crimes are not excused through exhaustive explanation. The story allows his final act to stand as a choice rather than a ledger. Redemption is presented as personal rather than historical. This preserves the weight of the moment without demanding justification beyond it. The trilogy understands that myth loses power when it over-explains itself. Vader's transformation works because it is sudden, decisive, and final. There is no attempt to soften what he has done or to turn his redemption into a prolonged process. The act matters precisely because it comes too late to undo the damage. Closure does not require erasure, it requires recognition. Han Solo represents another form of narrative completion that modern storytelling often overlooks. His journey is not about constant reinvention, but about arriving at commitment. Once he chooses the cause freely, his arc is finished. The story does not demand that he be tested repeatedly to validate that choice. Growth is allowed to conclude without being reopened. This respect for completion extends beyond individual characters into the structure of the galaxy itself. The Empire is not portrayed as an infinitely renewable threat, but as a regime whose power depends on fear, symbolism, and centralization. Once those elements collapse, the system falls with them. The story does not imply endless remnants or perpetual shadow wars. It accepts that victory can be decisive without being simplistic. A crucial reason the trilogy feels complete is its balance between explanation and mystery. The Force is introduced as something spiritual, intuitive, and personal, rather than mechanical or quantifiable. It is felt more than understood, and that ambiguity invites imagination rather than closing it off. Viewers are given enough to engage, but not so much that wonder is replaced by rules. The unseen remains powerful. This restraint allows the galaxy to feel vast without requiring exploration of every corner. Background details imply depth without demanding elaboration. The audience fills in the gaps, instinctively creating a participatory relationship with the story. This imaginative space is part of why the trilogy lingers so strongly. It trusts viewers rather than exhausting them. The themes of the trilogy are intentionally universal rather than topical. Hope, redemption, and resistance are framed as human constants rather than responses to a specific era. The story avoids anchoring itself too tightly to contemporary commentary, which allows it to age gracefully. Its relevance persists because it speaks to moral cycles rather than historical moments. This timelessness reduces the need for reinterpretation. Perhaps most importantly, the ending provides emotional closure rather than narrative obligation. The final scenes do not tease future conflict or unresolved threats. They rest in quiet relief, communal healing, and earned peace. The galaxy feels changed because the characters have changed. The story stops not because interest runs out, but because resolution has been achieved. This ending is powerful precisely because it refuses escalation. There is no promise of a greater enemy or a larger war on the horizon. The trilogy resists the instinct to keep raising stakes. It understands that escalation erodes meaning once the central question has been answered. Finality here is not absence, but fulfillment. By concluding decisively, the original trilogy positions itself as a myth meant to be revisited rather than extended. Its power comes from repetition, reinterpretation, and reflection rather than accumulation. Each return reinforces its themes instead of complicating them. The story remains intact because it knows when to end. That restraint is what made it complete, long before anything else was added. What followed the original trilogy was not a continuation born from narrative necessity, but an expansion driven by discomfort with endings. Star Wars did not stumble because it lacked material, but because it refused to accept completion. Instead of allowing the myth to stand and echo, the franchise began treating ambiguity as a flaw rather than a feature. Gaps that once invited imagination were reframed as problems to be solved. Mystery became inefficiency, and silence became risk. Later projects approached the original trilogy not as a finished story, but as an incomplete dataset. Every unanswered question was treated as an opportunity rather than a deliberate choice. The Force needed rules, origins, and metrics. The Jedi needed exhaustive histories. The galaxy needed timelines, maps, and explanations for every outcome. In attempting to clarify everything, the franchise slowly stripped away the very openness that gave the original story its power. One of the most damaging shifts was the compulsion to revisit and revise character legacies. Characters who had completed their arcs were pulled back into conflict, not because their stories demanded it, but because the franchise required familiar anchors. Growth that once felt final was reopened and often undone. Resolution was reframed as temporary rather than meaningful. This did not deepen the characters, it destabilized them. When Luke Skywalker's journey was reopened, it was not to explore new moral terrain, but to manufacture tension through regression. Achievements that once defined his arc were recontextualized as failures to justify further conflict. The mythic clarity of his ending was replaced with ambiguity that served plot rather than theme. Instead of building on completion, the story hollowed it out. What once felt earned now felt provisional. This pattern repeated across the saga. Redemption was no longer final peace, no longer stable, and victory no longer decisive. Each conclusion became a setup for reversal. The emotional language of the original trilogy was replaced with a logic of perpetual crisis. Stories stopped ending and started looping. The galaxy could never rest because rest threatened the engine of expansion. Over-explanation accelerated this erosion. Mysteries that once carried symbolic weight were reduced to law mechanics. The Force shifted from spiritual metaphor to quasi-scientific system. Destiny was reframed as biology or lineage rather than choice. This transformation did not clarify meaning, it narrowed it. What was once expansive and interpretive became rigid and literal. Retcons further fractured cohesion. New revelations repeatedly altered the context of earlier events, reshaping motivation and consequence retroactively. These changes were often designed to shock or reframe rather than to harmonize. The result was a saga that increasingly contradicted its own emotional logic. Continuity became a puzzle rather than a flow. Consistency gave way to correction. Tonal shifts compounded the problem. Projects oscillated between mythic seriousness and self-aware spectacle without committing fully to either. Humor undercut drama and nostalgia interrupted momentum. the franchise struggled to decide whether it wanted reverence or reinvention. This indecision produced stories that gestured toward depth before retreating into safety. Risk was introduced briefly and then neutralized. Constant expansion also altered priorities. Star Wars transitioned from storytelling to content generation. The goal was no longer to say something essential, but to remain present. Quantity replaced intention. Each new entry was required to keep the conversation alive rather than to conclude it. The saga became maintenance rather than myth. In this environment, endings became liabilities. Finality meant fewer hooks, fewer spin-offs, and fewer opportunities for reuse. Closure was treated as a dead end rather than an achievement. As a result, stories increasingly avoided resolution. Even climactic moments were designed to preserve optionality. Nothing could truly end because everything needed to remain usable. This refusal to let go diluted emotional impact. Sacrifice lost weight because it could be undone. Loss lost permanence because it could be reversed. Victory lost meaning because it could be overwritten. The original trilogy's power came from its willingness to commit. Later projects often hesitated at that same threshold. Commitment was replaced with contingency. The galaxy itself began to feel smaller as expansion continued. By filling in every era, every lineage, and every corner, the sense of vastness diminished. Surprise gave way to recognition. Instead of discovering new stories, audiences were asked to trace connections. The universe became dense but not deep. Familiarity replaced wonder. Most tellingly, the franchise struggled to trust its audience the way the original trilogy once had. Exposition increased, themes were reiterated, and ambiguity was avoided. Stories explained themselves repeatedly to ensure accessibility. In doing so, they underestimated the audience's capacity for interpretation. The myth stopped inviting participation and started issuing instructions. By refusing to let the story end, Star Wars did not preserve its legacy, it thinned it. The emotional clarity of the original trilogy was spread across too many continuations, too many revisions, and too many tonal compromises. What had once been a complete chapter became a reference point endlessly repurposed. The myth survived, but its center weakened. The tragedy is not that Star Wars continued, but that it continued without respecting what made its conclusion powerful. The original trilogy worked because it knew when to stop. It understood that some stories gain strength by ending. By treating finality as a flaw, the franchise lost the discipline that once defined it. Completion was mistaken for limitation. In the end, the most radical thing Star Wars could have done was nothing at all. Let the story stand, let the peace remain, and let imagination do the rest. Myths do not need constant revision to stay alive. They need space to resonate. The original trilogy left that space deliberately. Everything that followed struggled to respect it.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.